Hello, this is Dr. Kevin Garrison with a fifth video in a series of lectures on user-centered technology in education. Let's recap really quickly. Last week we talked about how not much has changed. If you go back to the 18th and 19th century model of education and compare it to the 21st century model, they're still very heavily influenced by book culture, by literacy, which encourages a decontextualized linear monologic environment. And you can see that we still encourage that same environment today. This week we're going to grapple with this question, which is how can we change the technologies of education, harness the power of these technologies so that we can have a better learning environment for our students. That's the question. The simple question is a very difficult answer. And my answer is this. It's by recognizing the biases of technology. If you recall Donald Norman's text on the design of everyday things, he talks a lot about the quote-unquote affordances of technology, meaning that the design itself affords a specific mentality toward it. So for instance, if you see something that sticks out like that, whether or not you know that it's a handle or you have the terminology to call it that, or you're in the culture that encourage you to think about this as a handle, your hand naturally gravitates to wrapping around this and picking it up. Now obviously he's goofing around with the image here so that you can't actually pour anything out. If you were to pour it anywhere, you would pour it back onto yourself and burn yourself. But the design affords a specific mentality. So let's turn this into a more theoretical sense, and then we'll see if we can apply it to Benedict Carey's ideas. And this is the thesis. It's one of Melvin Kranzberg's famous 6 theses about technology. His first one was this. He said that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. This was the topic of a conference several years back. Let's analyze this very quickly. Technology is neither good nor is bad. It's applying a moralistic tone about technology. If technology is good, then we have a moral imperative to further it, to push it onto people. So in other words, if we can conclude culturally that a cell phone is a good technology, then we should actively, ethically speaking, push that technology onto the populace. If it's bad, then we have a moral obligation to push it away from us, or to excommunicate it. Now, technology theorists have largely agreed that this is simply the wrong question. We shouldn't be talking about it in terms of good and bad. But then Kranzberg steps in and says, but if it's not good nor bad, then it has to be something in between, right? It has to have basically a neutral impact. So in other words, it has no ethical or moral impact. And he says that that's also wrong. So let's break down how this works. I'll give you an extended example. I'm a video gamer. Have been since I was a little boy. Got the first Nintendo system way back when I was a kid. And I must have wasted a huge number of hours playing Mario. So, let me explain how this idea works. Technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. We hear these concerns about technology all the time. That specifically in terms of video games. Video games are bad. Why? For obvious reasons. They waste time. If we think about the idea of time as money, the metaphor of time as money, then we recognize that anything that we use our time for that doesn't equate to money, then we have quite literally wasted it. Here's an example. If we think of higher education as a type of game, somebody like myself started off in high school. I graduated, that is, I leveled up. I went to a freshman in college. I leveled up again, got to a sophomore, leveled up again to the junior, to the senior, to the master's, and then finally the doctoral degree. And then I have this nice little diploma on the wall. And the diploma itself doesn't have any intrinsic value, right? It's simply a paper. It's a paper document. But the paper itself indicates that I have used my time frugally to the point that now I have something that is worth a lot of money. In other words, it allows me to become a professor and teach these classes. Video games do the same thing. They're very artificial in the terms that you're trying to level up to get to a specific goal. So for instance, the game that I'm favoring right now is The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. It's an open world game where it throws you, the character, into this big universe, and you're supposed to just spend your time figuring out how to collect items, trying to get new outfit, trying to get stronger weapons, so that you can take down the bad guy at the end. Now, it's quite literally a waste of time, because at the end of it, after you've taken down the bad guy, you have nothing to show for it. You might have a few more skill sets that you can market yourself toward in a job, but unlike a diploma, conquering a video game doesn't have any tangible reward. So it is quite literally a waste of time. Obviously, it encourages people to be physically inactive, great hand-eye coordination perhaps, but you're not actually moving. And as the science of exercise and physiology has been moving more toward the science of movement, we've recognized that it's not a question of I should be working out 30 minutes per day or 30 minutes 3 times a week, but rather that I should have an active lifestyle. Obviously, I have bones, I have muscles connecting those bones, and I have ligaments between them. I should be utilizing these things. Our bodies are made for movement, so video games are quote-unquote bad because they encourage a sedentary lifestyle. And then lastly, everybody hears this argument that people who play a lot of video games lose touch with reality, which makes sense. If you play Mario a lot like I did, it's a pretty mundane idea. You run across the screen, you fall in a hole, you die. You run into a turtle, you die. You run into a Goomba, you die. You do this over and over and over again, and at some point you start to associate the action that you're doing on the screen with things in the quote-unquote real world. So that if you take a class and you fail, you go, well, no problem. There's no consequences to that any more than dying in Mario, and so I will fail, and I'll try it again, and I'll fail, and I'll try it again. Unfortunately, it costs you a lot of money in the process. So if these things are all correct, and they are theses that work, then we would conclude that we have a moral imperative to keep people away from video games. We don't want people who spend a lot of time wasting it, who come out obese or physically sedentary, and people who have a disconnect between the real world and the virtual world. So we need to eschew video games, stay away from them. Well, then Stephen Johnson comes in his book, Everything Bad is Good for You. It's a fantastic little title, and it's a short, easy read, but he argues in an extended analysis that we're all confused. He says that, in fact, that for every argument that you can come up with about the bad of video games, you can come up with the exact opposite, the positives of video games. He argues in a very sardonic little piece about how video games are non-linear. And what that means is that it's user-driven. You can choose the path that you go for most games. And he argues that if you wanted to be very sardonic about it, you could argue that books are the exact opposite. And he says the following: perhaps the most dangerous property of a book is the fact that they follow a linear path. You can't control the narratives in any fashion. You simply sit back and have the story dictated to you. This risks instilling a general passivity in our children, making them feel as though they're powerless to change their circumstances. Now, he's being sardonic here, but he's saying essentially that if the medium does create the method, then a book implies that we're supposed to sit there in a passive sense, have the ideas being put to our head by the author to the reader, and that we don't have any responsibility beyond that, that we're completely powerless. And he says the video games encourage the exact opposite. So if you're dichotomizing it and you're saying that passivity is bad and interactivity is good, well, obviously let's go with video games as opposed to book learning. And he says the same thing for other things, like delayed gratification. People will take forever in a video game doing the same mundane task over and over again to get to a specified reward. Let me give you a simple example. In a game Call of Duty, I get these points that I'm able to spend on upgrading weapons. Now, I only get a few number of these points every day that I log in. But if you do it often enough, then you can accumulate enough that you can get some really nice upgrades. So for several months, and I'm not making this up, several months, Every day I would log in briefly to my PlayStation 4, pull up Call of Duty, and I would get my daily points. And I would do this. It's a very mundane task. There's no immediate gratification. It's all delayed. And after several months, I was finally able to get the gun that I wanted, the upgrade that I wanted. So we will go through an infinite number of delayed gratifications so that we can have the specified outcome. And on and on and on. We can have better problem-solving skills. There's other things that are happening, collateral learning that we don't actually take into consideration when we're doing our studies, etc. So he says, everything bad for you is actually good for you. And he analyzes this not only in terms of video games, but also in terms of television, in terms of the internet, etc. If we're not careful, we would end it on that narrative. You either have to be a technophile or a technophobe. You argue that technology is good, or you argue that technology is bad. But if you reject that narrative outright, then it leaves you with this following conclusion. Well, then technology has to be neutral. It's just simply, it is what it is. You know, if you play a video game, there's going to be some bad things about it. There's going to be some good things about it. But we can't moralize about it. Just choose to do it or you choose not to. That's all there is to it. But we can't stop there. The substantive argument takes over where the neutral argument ends, and it argues the following. This is Andrew Feinberg's 1999 text, Questioning Technology, where he says that technology is not neutral, but embodies specific values. Now, Andrew Feinberg is not a substantivist, but this is a good, concise definition of substantivism, which is one of those big words. Substantivism simply argues that technologies have a marked impact on the substances of our lives and our substances of thought. Hence the word substantive. It has a substantive impact. Let me give you some very brief examples of how this works so that we can get away from this good versus bad narrative and into the idea of how technology is also not neutral. So here's example one. Should I sit on chairs? From a good or a bad standpoint, you would just simply look at it, well, chairs, yeah, they're kind of deforming, but they're awful relaxing. And you go back and forth on the goods and bads of them. But the substantive argument, such as what Edward Tenner argues, is that when you choose to sit in a chair, and he argues this in his book, Our Own Devices, that you have chosen a specific lifestyle. And more importantly, when you sit down in a chair, it weakens the back, it weakens the spine muscles, and you stand up after a long, hard day of working in the office. Oh, that hurts. And then when you get home, you've had a long, rough day, and you sit down in your lazy boy recliner, and you sit them even more. And so the chair itself is not a question of good and bad. It just is. The chair simply gives you the opportunity to sit down. But what we've chosen in the process is a specific lifestyle and a specific mentality, and more importantly, once we sit down, it also changes our physical structure so that we're more inclined to do so in the future. Here's another example. Let's talk about guns. This is a very controversial political topic, but we'll take it on. Do guns kill people? Do people kill people? Or do people with guns kill people? This is an inane argument. It's all we get. Guns kill people. Well, of course guns kill people. Also knives kill people, cars kill people, people fall off of bridges, so bridges kill people. I mean, technologies are involved in the killing of people. But then the big question is, it's not the guns itself that kill people, but do the people kill people themselves? Well, of course, somebody has to pull the trigger. The gun can't do that on its own. Somebody has to drive off a cliff. The cliff doesn't have any, it might have an affordance for you to drive off the cliff, but the cliff itself does not make you do so. And so then the infamous conclusion, which is that people with guns kill people, which is really not much of a helpful statement. It's obvious. If I have a gun and I shoot at somebody, then the person using the gun has killed another person. Now, the substantive argument comes in and says the following, that it's not that guns are good, and we should argue for them, Republicans. It's not that guns are bad, we should argue against them, Democrat. It's not that they're both, it's just a neutral kind of idea. It's rather that when you pick up a rifle, or you pick up a pistol, that it changes the way that you conceptualize life. Let me give you an example. I'm a fisherman. When I catch a fish, and I pull it out, and I'm out of the water, and I take the hook out, and I'm filleting it. Now, there's several layers of mediation that happen for me to be able to do that. When you have life in your hands, and it's wiggling, it's squirming, it's trying to get away from you. Its instinct is to stay alive and to get back into the water, and it's suffocating quite literally as you're holding it. It's a very powerful, passionate moment. What am I supposed to do here? Now, my hands are not capable physically of killing that fish unless I just start whacking it against a stone or something like that. But even then, I've used an intermediary, the stone, a technology to help me with that. Now, when you start bringing in technologies, it allows for you to distance yourself from that, from the very real life or death question. And instead, I can take a knife and I can fillet the fish, or I can take a hammer and whack the catfish on the head so it stops moving. And catfish are hard to kill, so you have to do something to kill it before you start filleting it. Otherwise, it'll still be alive even after you cut the meat off. But you're filleting the fish. It allows for there to be a distancing to take place. It's now mediated. Death is mediated through a technology as opposed to through the hands. Now, because of that, the technology then changes the way that you conceptualize life. So that the first time that I went hunting, I was looking down the sights of my rifle. This, by the way, is the infamous 1894 model Winchester, or model 1894 Winchester, one of the most famous rifles in history. When I was looking down the rifle, I lined it up. One of my cousins said, "Hey, there's a turtle down there, you should take it out in the river." And without thinking, I shot it. To my ever-living disgrace. I had turtles growing up. I loved turtles. They're one of my favorite pets of all time. When we go to the zoo, one of my favorite animals to just sit down and just watch are the slow-moving turtles. Ancient creatures. Beautiful movers. And I just lined one up and shot it and blew it to bits. The rifle serves as a mediation between the two, and it reconceptualizes how I conceive of life. So it's not a question of whether or not the guns kill people, or people kill people, or people with guns kill people. What the problem is that the weapon is quite that. It allows for me to reconceptualize how I think of life. And it's a lot harder to take out something that's here face to face than it is from a distance. Because if you can imagine, if you're a deer hunter and the deer is right in front of you, and you have to listen to it squeal, you have to listen to it pant, you have to watch its eyes go wild as it's panicking, trying to escape. The closer you are to that, the more the human element takes over, and you say, "I can't do this." The further you are removed from it, the easier it is to do so. So substantivism steps in and makes this argument, this final one here. Is Google making us stupid? This is a famous article by Carr. What's his first name? Nicholas Carr, back in 2008. Well, he was asking this question: is Google making us dumb? Is it making us stupid? Well, again, that's the wrong question. It's not a question of is Google good or is it bad. It's simply a question of how is Google changing the way that we think. Now, the answer to that question, let's grapple with that a bit. Now, if you take on the good side of things, then you would argue this. People in the 90s and the early 2000s did. Several of my instructors back at Texas Tech, I asked them face-to-face in their office, I said, "Why are you so in favor of online education?" And these were basically their answer, that traditional education is flawed. There's not a human being alive who would argue that traditional education is a powerful way for students to learn. Does learning take place? Absolutely. Do they have some success in life afterwards? Absolutely. Could we do better? Absolutely. So the hope was that when digital spaces came on board in the 90s and the early 2000s, that we'd be able to harness the power of the computer, the power of digital spaces, to teach better. So for instance, rather than having an observational mentality, we could have a participatory mentality. The internet, for instance, encourages that. If you go to, like I do, DallasCowboys.com, I can actually participate in the discussion about what the Cowboys should have done, who they should have drafted, as opposed to simply observing that process from a detached standpoint. I can go into dialogues with other people as opposed to monologues, so that if I was teaching a writing class in a traditional sense, in a face-to-face environment, then it's very much monologue-centered. The teacher lectures to the student, and then the student writes a paper, gives it back to the teacher, and the teacher reads it and grades it. And there is no discussion in the process. It's all mediated through the paper. But in a dialogic sense, in an online space, you could have those students write the exact same thing in a blog, for instance, or a discussion board with multiple audience members all interacting with that particular text. Now you have a real-world audience, and your words matter. They have an impact. It's hypertextual, which is more how the brain thinks. We think associatively. So rather than thinking in a linear sense, A to B to C to D to E to F to G, etc., we think hypertextually. I can go from A to Z, back to B, to F, back to A if I want to, and I can jump around based on how my brain is hardwired. Look, people got really excited. Technology. Digital spaces. It's going to revolutionize higher education, or education in general. It didn't happen. Here's some examples of how it went wrong from the quote-unquote bad side of things. This is also from Carr's article. He argued 2008, based on a study and anecdotal evidence, that people started skimming when they read. Here's an example. This is an anecdotal piece. He says that his friend, Bruce Friedman, said this, quote-unquote, "I have now almost totally lost the ability to read and absorb a longish article on the web or in print. Spending too much time on the internet had made him unable to read a longish article." He says, "I can't read War and Peace anymore. I've lost the ability to do that. Even a blog post of more than 3 or 4 paragraphs is too much. I skim it." End quote. We all do that. The more we read online, the more we get inclined to simply skim information to get to the point that we're trying to find so that we can move on with our lives rather than absorbing information in a very longish format. The lack of context. This is Neil Postman's argument from 1985, one of the most fantastic arguments of all time. He argues that the telegraph created decontextualized spaces. In other words, when you can transmit information over a telegraph line from point A to point B, now people can get information that is decontextualized. I know something is happening from point A, even though I don't actually live there. He says the following. He gives a quote from Henry David Thoreau, who said, quote-unquote, "We are in a great haste to construct a magnetic telegraph from Maine to Texas. But Maine and Texas, it may be, have nothing important to communicate." He's being very sardonic, of course, but Postman says that the telegraph gave a form of legitimacy to the idea of context-free information, which he argues is dominating television. So if you watch television frequently, it starts to dictate how you think. You log in, well not log in, but you turn on the television in the evenings, you watch the nightly news at say 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, and you're watching news article after news article or story after story. They're all 30 seconds long. They're decontextualized, meaning there's something that's happening in Washington, there's something that's happening in Abilene, there's something that's happening down the street, somewhere in town, but it's something I haven't seen today. It's all decontextualized, 30-second clip, 45-second clip, and then we go to a commercial break, and we see something about an advertisement for some kind of product that's also decontextualized from our immediate life, and then we're back to some more news article or news story. We hear those. We take a break. And if we do that over and over again, we completely lose sight of what's actually happening. If somebody was to ask you, what did you hear last night on the news? You would say, I have no idea, any more than if somebody asked you, what did you read on Facebook yesterday? This is all decontextualized information that we don't have any connection to. Johnson, in 2014, argued that there is a difference between recognition and recall, that the brain is naturally primed toward recognition, not recall. Simple example, if you meet somebody one time, you will be able to recognize their face almost instantly several years later. I know that person. I've met that person. Oh, I know that person's name. However, if somebody was to ask you to recall what that person looked like, they said, didn't you met John the other day, John Doe? You met him, right? What did he look like? Describe him for me. What color was his hair, the color of his eyes, how tall was he? You would fail on that very quickly. You would have a hard time recalling that information. But if John showed up, even if you've forgotten his name, you can say, I know that guy. And so the internet encourages people to think in terms of one over the other. In other words, I recognize the path that I took to get to information, but I very rarely recall what I found. And this makes sense. If we think in terms of now Google searches, a recognition mentality means that I can recognize the search process, but I don't remember and I cannot recall what the outcome was. This is Richard Lennon's critique in 2006. He says that there's so much information online that we're getting bogged down in the world of quote-unquote fluff over stuff. There's so much information that the one most important thing that we're lacking is attention. We have a very finite amount of attention, so everything has to be elevated in terms of the rhetoric, in terms of its fluffiness, to make us want to watch it. It's changing our sleeping behaviors. Obviously, if you look at a cell phone in the middle of the night or right before you go to bed or when you wake up in the morning, it changes your brainwave activity. The blue light changes how sleepy you are. It wakes you up. It keeps you awake. It changes who we're talking to. We think that the digital spaces are dialogic, but they're not actually dialogic. This is an image from Twitter, a Twitter map from 2016, the election. Everything in red are people who are having conversations about Donald Trump. Everything in blue are people who are having conversations about Hillary Clinton. You'll notice that there are very few people who are having conversations about both. It's a very small minority of the population. The vast majority of people who were inclined to vote toward Donald Trump or for Donald Trump and to think in a Republican mindset, we're talking to other people who also share the exact same mindset and the exact same thing for the Democrats. Very few people were actually having a cross-interdisciplinary conversation. And so we're not actually having dialogue. We're not listening to each other. We're actually talking past one another. And then here's the last example. This is from my own experience. You can see these grades down here. We think online education, the savior of education. Not so much. These are numbers from when I taught an online 3351, which is technical writing here at ASU. This was the average or the mean GPA after several semesters of teaching online versus several semesters of teaching face-to-face. You'll notice that the numbers are 0.39 higher. In other words, nearly half a GPA higher. That's substantial. In other words, if you are inclined to take an online class, then your likely grade is going to be below a 2.0. It's not good. The average GPA for someone coming out of a public institution in Texas is about a 3.1. So extremely low numbers if you take an online tech writing class. If you take it face-to-face, it jumps up to a more reasonable 2.37. Why is this? Well, I could speculate all day long about it, but there's something about, and this is significant in terms of the number of people we've polled here, is significant in the difference between 1.98 and 2.37. And the only difference is not the content, but it's the delivery of that content, specifically the medium of the internet. So, what does this all mean? It means that if we can't spend our time arguing whether something is good or bad, which is easy to do, the internet's good, the internet's bad, video games are great, video games are horrible, television is great, television is horrible, and you can argue this all day long, but rather when you start to think about it at this third level, is that it's not good, it's not bad, nor is it neutral. In other words, by not saying it's neutral, we're indicating that it has a substantive impact on who we are and how we think. Therefore, we have to have, and this is the big word, reflection. We have to know what we're getting into before we get into it. So this is where Carrie's article comes into place, and what you're going to be doing for this week's big assignment is you're attempting to take the ideas from this book and apply it to an educational module. With this in mind, which is that oftentimes we have a tendency to forget that, as technology studies have shown, a tool such as a computer is not intrinsically a reason for optimism or for pessimism. Instead, technology, and this is the big thing, technology and its use must be governed by informed educators and users. When we recognize, and this is key, when we recognize that all education is decontextualized, it doesn't matter if you're teaching through a book, It doesn't matter if you're teaching through a PowerPoint presentation. It doesn't matter if you're teaching through a traditional classroom space. It doesn't matter if you're teaching on Blackboard or a YouTube video. All education that is mediated is decontextualized. Once we recognize that, we can reframe the way that education is taught by putting it into actual face-to-face contexts, things that are better and more likely to strike our memory. Or consider dialogic. You can have a face-to-face class where people are not talking to one another. And depending upon how you structure the furniture in that space, you might incline or encourage people to have those conversations more or less often. Same thing with digital spaces. Just having Blackboard doesn't mean that people are going to talk with one another. But if you set up a digital space, such as a blog or a discussion board post, you encourage people to have those conversations back and forth with one another as opposed to in a student talking to a professor. Or if we recognize that students need space to incubate their thoughts, to work on a problem and to step away from that problem, then we can do that in both digital spaces and face-to-face spaces, depending upon how much time we have. Introduce a thought, let them be distracted by other thought, and then come back to the problem at hand, and more than likely their subconscious brain would have kicked in and helped them through that process. Or recognizing that students need sleep in order to process the information that they've learned. I mean, immediately after they've learned something, it's best if they can have that deep REM cycle that comes in early sleep so that those ideas are cemented up here. Once we recognize this, we can begin to formulate what might be the ideal education that's not dependent upon technology. And it's not technological determinism in the sense that we just simply grab onto a technology and shove it forward and say, this is a good thing, or take it away, this is a bad thing. But rather, we, with reflection, recognize that how we teach impacts what we teach. And we choose our technologies accordingly. And that's your goal for this week. See if you can take these ideas and apply it to an educational module and see how things might change to be quote-unquote more ideal. All right, I'm done. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.